switch feeder, take one on 3, 2.
Morning everybody. When Tony first asked me to do a video on feeder fishing, I thought to myself, where the hell am I going to start? And you know, I really don't know where I'm going to start now, because I've just gone through a box of old feeders that are in the tackle shop and stuck them out. And you know, anybody who's new to fishing would look at that lot and go, where, what, why? And yeah, so I'm going to try and explain what feeder fishing is all about. And let me go back to when I was a kid, when the block end feeder first came out. We used to fish the River Thames, and the Thames used to flow quite hard. We used to catch dace and barbel and chub and roach and things with these block end feeders. What we used to do is get a bit of acetate, similar to this, roll it round, punch it out with a punch, and we used to put a little cap on either end, and we put our maggots in there and chuck it out into the middle of the river and wait for the rod to go round. And we had lots of different indicators. We used to have a piano wire with a slight little spring that went round the top to make the rod go like that, and all sorts of nonsense. But it works, and that's when feeder fishing is my first memory with feeder fishing. But it's sort of evolved since then, and one of the first things that happened was a guy called Peter Drennan. You've heard of Drennan Tackle. He made the Drennan feeder, and I think it may have been, apart from perhaps it might have been a stick float, probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is probably one of the first items of tackle ever brought out. And this looked after us for a long, long while. And basically it was just a little gadget. You pull the top off, put your maggots in there, chuck it out, and the maggots would crawl out around your hook bait, and there would be your hook length would be hanging off of there, and your hook bait would be near it. So that was the Drennan feeder. And then came the ground bait feeder, which was like an open end feeder, which was something like that. And you'd put the ground bait in either end. Sometimes you put a bit of ground bait in one end, and you put a few maggots in, and then you put a bit of ground bait over the top, and you chuck that out. And then got a bit more involved with the different types of the Drennan feeder. Got a bit, well, this one's got a big lump of lead on, which you can cast a long, long way. It's more aerodynamic, and again, so that's got a bit of power gum in there, so you can fill your maggots up into there. But no matter what feeder you use, they all do the same thing. The idea with a swim feeder is to put feed around your hook bait, so it attracts the fish around to your hook bait. So my advice to anybody when they're feeder fishing is think about what you're trying to do and how you're going to best achieve it, because you could find that you've got a river that's flowing really, really fast in flood, in which case you're going to need a feeder with a load of lead on it like that, which is going to hold the bottom, bosh. Or you might find you've got a little lake in the winter that's only about that deep, and you just want to put a little tiny bit of feed on, and you'll use a little feeder like that, and you put a little tiny bit of crumb in and a few little pinkies, and you'll cast it out over to where you're feeding. So so there's different variations to the theme, so many different variations. I can't explain to you what you do with what, but I suppose it's sort of self-explanatory. I mean, this feeder here is designed because of the nature of the shape of it, is to cast this a real long way into a lake. Okay, so you can get a lot of feed out a long, long way. So if you're fishing a reservoir and you want to get a lot of feed out a long, long way, the breamer out 60 or more turns on your reel, you know, talking about 50 yards away, you might want to use a feeder that's aerodynamic like this to get yourself out there. And depending on the depth of the water, you might want to either put your ground bait in very, very soft if it's shallow, or you might want to put your ground bait in and really crunch it in really hard if it's deep, so that your ground bait actually starts to come out the feeder as it's hitting the bottom, where your hook bait is going to lay into your ground bait on the bottom. So you've got to think about what you're using that feeder for. You wouldn't throw that into your local little commercial lake into 4 or 5 foot of water, because it'll probably stick 12 inches into the silt, and it'll probably drag your hook bait into the silt as well, so you'd probably never catch anything. So if you're going to be fishing little lakes, I would say these little feeders are ideal. You're going to put a little bit of loose ground bait and bits in there, and your hook length comes off of there, so that when your ground bait goes around the bottom, your hook length is sitting on top of it. So it goes like that, and your hook length will sit in somewhere where your ground bait is. So this is your maggot feeder. Maggot feeders like this, generally speaking, I would say they're going to be used for rivers or slow moving waters, because that's generally where your maggot feeder comes into its own. If you're going to throw this into a lake, what's going to happen is your maggots will crawl out of it after a while, but probably most of them will stay in there. And then when you reel back, because of the flow of the water going through the feeder, you're going to just throw a trail of maggots right away from where you were fishing to where you lift it out of the water. So you're going to put your fish all over the place. So that's not ideal. If you're going to use a feeder where you want to put maggots out, then you're probably better off using a smaller one, either something like that or something like this, where you can put a little bit of ground bait in, a few maggots, a little bit more ground bait. Then when you go it out, you could strike your line very quickly and strike your bait out. Okay, so you'll leave a little pile of maggots on the bottom. But think about what you're trying to do and why you're doing it. Some of the anglers now will use a feeder probably a little bit more like that one, and they'll take that bit off, okay, and they'll put their maggots in there, so it's block end there, and just put a little tiny bit of ground bait in there. So when they cast it out, as it's flying through the air, the maggots will stay there. As it hits the water, then the ground bait will come out, and then you can get a big pile of maggots come out on the bottom there, and the maggots will fall freely through the water to the bottom. So it depends what you're trying to do, what sort of fish you're going to be trying to catch, and how you want to be trying to catch them. So, let me think, what else can I tell you about fishing a feeder? It's just amazing. I mean, this one here is designed for casting a long way, and you depend on what depth again you're fishing. You might want to put a lot of ground bait in there, or sticky ground bait in there, or whatever, just to get your feed a long way. It's even actually made with fins on it to make it go more direct. It's just a multitude of them about. But generally speaking, commercial fisheries, you'll want to be fishing a little open end feeder like that, unless you want to go to the other way, which is like the preferred method nowadays, is the method feeder. And this works really, really well. Method feeder. Yeah. I've already done a video on fishing a method feeder, but basically your line goes right the way through there. Your hook comes off a little short hook length. You'll put your ground bait in there. You'll use your feeder on there. That pushes in and it comes out. It gives a nice pile of ground bait with your hook bait on top of it, and that will lay on the bottom nicely, and the fish will come and take it off there. That can work really, really, really well. So your method feeder is probably a good mainstay for very slow moving water. Probably not too deep. I wouldn't have thought if it's too deep you'll probably lose your ground bait off the top before it hits the bottom, which is probably useless. Again, if you're going to do something like that, think about what you're doing. Make your ground bait up a little bit more sticky so it stays on the feeder. till it hits the spot where you want it to be fed. So yeah, how you run a feeder on the line, again, there's a multitude of little stops here, but basically what we used to use was a loop and put a split shot on the back and just run it down the line on a swivel and stop it. This little gadget you can make up, and pretty much what you do is when you make your loop, if you see if you can twist it in, if you twist your line like that when you make your loop, okay, and then tie that off, then it makes that stand off away from your feet. See what they've done here? That little bit stands off away from your feet, so it stops it from tangling. So your hook length comes off then, it stops it from tangling. So if you're doing your own, make it up like that. So just get your line, twist it with your fingers like that. And you can make a nice little standoff. And if you're really clever, you can get a piece of silicone, tie that off a nice knot in it. A piece of silicone, similar to what they've done here on this one, and push the silicone over that knot. That ties it nice and tight, and it acts as a nice damper for your hook. And I've just broken the feeder. It's about 30 years old. It's about time it fell apart. These are quite good actually. If you're too lazy to make your own rigs up, you can buy these ones. Cresta do these, and they're really good little bit of kit. But you can make it up yourself. There's a multitude of different ways, but basically what it is, either your feeder's sliding on the line, and your hook length comes off the end. That's it. So yeah, just think about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, and basically what you're trying to achieve is to put a bed of ground bait or bait on the bottom with your hook length in between it. If you concentrate on thinking about that, that's your favourite way, and it should be fairly obvious what sort of feeder you're going to need to use on the day. I hope that's going to be helpful. Cheers. Bye bye.